I want to do a little bit to sort of orient you to where the structures were on the property. If you come over here and take a look at this image right here, if you note this sweep in the curve of the road right there, and then this little jog right there going this way, we think that that is this sweep right here, and then this little leg of it coming here. So there was a very imposing three-story structure right here on the site that you're looking at right now. We wish we could share the real thing with you today, but we're going to do the best that we can based on what we've done to research the property and how it was situated. Let's come over this way a little bit. The core of the building was in a building that was the Villa Ridge Inn. The Villa Ridge Inn was a luxury resort hotel built on this site in the 1880s. It opened in 1889, and it began right here. That's how the house started out, and it existed as the Confederate home from 1902 to 1920, when it was destroyed by a large fire. Now, there was a complex of buildings all over this ridge, and you're going to see what it looks like as we kind of go the rest of that way. But buildings were built, buildings were torn down, you know, some buildings changed function. A building that was built over here as an infirmary eventually became the home itself after this burned down. It had wings that were libraries, and they became different wards for different illnesses, TB, cancer, that sort of thing. So it was a very complicated sort of set of structures up here on the property. Well, why was there a Confederate home here in Kentucky? Let's go back to the beginning anyway. In 1861, when the war began, Abraham Lincoln asked the governor of Kentucky for troops, and that governor, in short, told him, no, we will not send any troops to the Union to fight against their sister southern states. And Jefferson Davis asked Kentucky as well, and they said, no, we're not supplying troops, period. They remained neutral, but not for long. By September of 1861, the legislature was forced to take a vote, and they joined the Union. In spite of that, Kentucky sent some 40,000 troops to fight for the Confederacy during the war. I should also mention, not that it's that much western Kentucky, but we had somebody from South Central here. Kentucky established its own Confederate capital, a separate Confederate capital in Bowling Green. So among those, of those 40,000 Confederate troops from Kentucky, they volunteered and served in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 9th Kentucky Infantry, Cobb's Battery, Graves Battery, Burns Battery, and collectively this group became known as the Orphan Brigade. And we're going to take a step over here in a second and talk with Jeff Walden, who is interpreting a soldier from the Orphan Brigade, and he's going to tell you a little bit about their action during the Civil War. One thing I want to point out here, this photograph, like that other one, in certain places we place photographs in a location where we think the photographer was when they took them originally. This was on a Confederate Decoration Day somewhere around the turn of the century. So the camera would have been set about right here looking this way, and this was the Villa Ridge Inn portion of it, and some temporary sort of pergola that they had constructed on the site. Let's take a step over here. Okay, this is Jeff Walden, and Jeff is going to tell you a little bit about the Orphan Brigade and its service.
I want to talk to you a little while today about one of the most famous units that served in the Confederate Army from the state of Kentucky. That was a unit called the Kentucky Orphan Brigade, or 1st Kentucky Brigade. And I need to explain the name Orphan Brigade because that's somewhat an unusual name for a military unit to have. When Kentucky was pursuing a policy of official neutrality in the summer of 1861, any citizen who wanted to join the Confederate forces had to leave the state to do so. Most of the men went south just into Tennessee, just over the state line, and they formed units there. They formed infantry regiments and artillery batteries. These banded together into a brigade that became known as the 1st Kentucky Brigade. When the Confederates moved back into Kentucky in September 1861, this unit went to Bowling Green. They stayed there till the spring of 1862 or the late winter of 1862, when military reverses forced the Confederates to leave the state. At that time, the members of the 1st Kentucky Brigade left their homes in Kentucky, and they were never able to return through the entire war. They couldn't go on furlough and go home and visit their families during the war. They could not recruit to replenish their ranks from home during the war. It was very difficult for them to get packages from home. It was very difficult even to get letter mail. Letter mail, if someone in Kentucky wanted to write to their relative who was in the Orphan Brigade in the South, it had to go into the Federal Postal Service, and it had to go through a truce system that they had in Maryland, and it had to go through the lines, and then it went into the Confederate postal system, and then it went south, and maybe it got to the soldier months later, maybe it never got to the soldier to whom it was addressed. Because of this, the soldiers of the Kentucky Brigade began to feel that they were exiled from their home states, that they were orphans who had no home but the Confederate Army. And coupled with that, they lost 2 brigade commanders in combat and 1 who died of disease during the war, and that just contributed to their feeling of being orphaned. And they may have started to call themselves the Orphan Brigade by the end of the war. There's some evidence that perhaps that was in use during the war, but they really started the name after the war. The veterans, when they came home, they formed veteran groups, and then they started to call themselves the Orphan Brigade, and that's how we know it today. That's the famous name that it's called by. The Orphan Brigade fought all across the South in the Western Theater. This part of the country was the West then, as opposed to the East, Virginia, where General Lee fought. The Western Theater was in this part of the country. They fought from Bowling Green south to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They fought from Vicksburg, Mississippi, all the way east to Savannah, Georgia. They fought in such battles as Shiloh in Tennessee, Murfreesboro, which was also called the Battle of Stones River. They charged massed federal cannon there, about 58 guns on a ridge line that they were ordered to charge, and they were not able to take that position, but in the course of that battle they lost almost half of their number. They fought at Chickamauga. They fought all through the Atlanta campaign, 4 months in the summer of 1864. Then at the end of the Atlanta campaign, they were granted one of their wishes all through the war was to be mounted, to either be turned into cavalry or mounted infantry, because they thought that would get them home to Kentucky, like Morgan's cavalry. But it was too late by that part of the war. They were never able to go into Kentucky. They finished the war as mounted infantry, and they fought one of the last battles of the war between the states at the end of April 1865 in South Carolina. This was 3 weeks after General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. The Orphan Brigade was still fighting. Then the first week of May 1865, they were moved into Georgia, and they surrendered there. Of course, when they surrendered, there was no Confederate government. It was ended. It was all over. There was nobody to arrange their passage back home or anything else. They were lucky that where they surrendered, part of the Confederate treasury ended up there, so each man got between $2 and $4 in silver and gold coins to go home with, so they didn't go home destitute. They were allowed to keep the horses that they had used as mounted infantry. They moved back home in groups. They came to Nashville, and the federal authorities rounded them up, took their horses away from them, told them they all had to take the oath of allegiance to the United States if they wanted to go home to Kentucky. So they did. They took the oath. The war was over. There wasn't any use in any further resistance, so they went home to Kentucky. They didn't come home to find a devastated land like much of the South was. But what they came home to find was a change in sentiment. When they had left Kentucky, Kentucky had been taken over by a Union government, and Union sentiment prevailed in the state, and they were exiled. When they came home, because of the way the federal government treated Kentucky during the last 2 years of the war, they found that they were welcomed back not as the enemy, but perhaps as heroes. During the last 2 years of the war, the federal government had treated Kentucky as enemy territory, and of course that didn't sit well with native Kentuckians who were Union in sentiment, because everybody who was Southern in sentiment, they either kept their mouths shut or they had gone south. But the way the federal government treated the state really changed the sentiment. Because of that, when the Confederate veterans came home, it didn't take very long before they were able to take over local and county governments and even state government and really influence affairs in Kentucky for years after that. They formed veterans groups, and of course, when many of them became old, they lived here in the Confederate home at Pewee Valley. I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the soldiers, the veterans of the Orphan Brigade who lived here at the Confederate home. The soldier on your left, furthest from me, his name was George Johnson. He was not an official resident of the home, but he might have been one of those veterans who moved in and out of the home and stayed for a little while because he lived right over here in Floydsburg. He served during the war in the 4th Kentucky Infantry, and in this picture, he's wearing his Confederate veterans uniform, which looks like the kind of uniform they wore in the home, so maybe it was just one of the standard veterans uniforms. Maybe he got it at the home. But he was posing at a big Confederate reunion they had in Louisville in 1905. The next soldier who's standing there, his name was Henry Rau. It was a German name, R-A-U. He was descended from German immigrants who had settled in Louisville. He became a sergeant in the 4th Kentucky Infantry and fought throughout the war. Then when he was an old man, he did live at the home for a while. He didn't, and I think he posed in his veteran's uniform here at the home. We can't really track down exactly where that picture was taken, but I think it was taken here on the grounds of the home. He died in Louisville. He didn't die at the home, and he was buried in Cave Hill Cemetery. The next soldier was named Theodore Coward. He was from Taylor County. He joined the Army when he was 17 years old. He fought in all the battles of his regiment. He was wounded 3 times. The last wound was so severe that they had to amputate his right arm. You can see his empty right sleeve in that picture. He spent the rest of the war in hospitals and came back at the end of the war and settled in Louisville, where he worked in the Public Works Department despite his disability of only having one arm. He also posed at the Confederate reunion in 1905, and he died in Louisville, and he's buried in Cave Hill Cemetery. The last soldier on my side is James W. Nelson. He joined the Army in 1861 and served in the 4th Kentucky Infantry. He rose to the rank of corporal. He served all through the war and surrendered in 1865. And after the war, he also posed during the Confederate reunion in 1905, and he became a resident of the home and spent his last years at the home and died here, and he's buried in the Confederate cemetery over there. These are the sorts of men who served in the Orphan Brigade and came back and helped make Kentucky a great place to live after the war.
But the fact of the matter is, the Confederate States had a problem. You know, Jeff told you about these veterans and what happened to them. At the end of the war, they go home. But beyond that, you know, in the North, you have a Veterans Administration and you have a strong Grand Army of the Republic that is a veterans organization of Civil War veterans. And the federal government paid pensions to federal or Union veterans. The federal government was not about to pay a pension to former combatants. So the responsibility accelerated as time marched on. You have a bunch of 20, 30, 40-year-olds in 1860. By the time you reach the 1890s, you have 60, 70, 80-year-old men who have no, they have no visible means, or they're destitute, they're sick, they're still suffering from wounds that they sustained during the war, and these states took it upon themselves, the southern states took it upon themselves to do the equivalent of what was a VA hospital in the North or a pension system, and they created this home. And Jeff alluded to the fact that a lot of these veterans came home and they started getting involved in Kentucky politics, and the fact of the matter is they got enough political will and juice by the 1880s and 1890s that they were able to get the state to buy into a program where they could purchase this home. So in the 1890s, the idea of a Confederate home accelerated, and you know, these homes were elsewhere. They were in all the southern states. They were even in Oklahoma and California, where a number of Confederate veterans had established. Probably the big moment happens in 1902, when the Kentucky legislature authorizes the purchase and furnishing of a residence to accommodate at least 25 veterans. Okay, that's going to grow from there. The requirements are that whatever home they buy must house 25 veterans. It must be on 30 acres of land. And when these conditions were met, and the veterans group that was going to fund the purchase of this, then they would do that, and then the state would take over the ongoing maintenance of that home. Veterans looked all over the state. There was heavy competition for the home, except in Pewee Valley, where the residents fought against it. They didn't want, they thought they were going to be sort of, this destitute group, a burden on the community. It would be bad for business. It'd be bad for people who were largely coming here as a summer residence from Louisville. Be that as it may, economics won the day. The Villa Ridge Inn, opened in 1889, but it didn't make it. It wasn't financially sound, and while that structure was, issued bonds to build it in the amount of $50,000, this property was for sale in 1902 for $8,000. It wasn't in bad shape. It had full furnishings, and that's the cause. The money was right. There was less work to be done to get it up and going, so that's how the home came to be here in Pewee Valley. So to give you a brief description of it, it had 72 rooms, this original portion, a dining hall, a kitchen, running water, steam heat, gas lighting, and it only, as I said before, needed minimal work. And it was capable of holding up to 125 men. So with that, the home officially opened in 1902. Population went up and down, as we said before. Maybe up to 1,000 men lived here at over the course of the years, and at any given time there may have been up to 300 living here at one time. The next big addition, there were a lot of these requisitions going into the legislature to add buildings. Buildings came, buildings went, buildings were torn down, they were added. But the next big request was in 1907, in 1904, when an infirmary was added. As these men got sicker and sicker, the need for a hospital-like setting that was beyond just a rest home became evident, and an infirmary was built over on this property. So this main building probably ended over here in this area somewhere, and these pillars here, they probably happened after the 1920 fire. After the 1920 fire, when this structure was gone from here, there would have been a new entry that they configured going into the infirmary section, and that's where we're going to go right now. So if you follow me in single file and watch your step. As we were talking about the infirmary, we're going to kind of give you a glimpse of where it was on the site. If you come stand over here, I'll be able to orient you a little bit better. Local tradition has it that this was the horseshoe stand that the Confederate soldiers used while they were here. Maybe, but probably not. We found out a little bit of information in our research. If you come up here, you will see that this is the center section of the infirmary. There was a center 2-story, 2.5-story section, and then it had a north wing and a south wing that had different functions. There was a library there, part of it was a hospital. If you look closely, in the foreground you see 2 concrete stands. You remember that cannon that was on a carriage that we saw in the photograph before? After that fire at some point, whether it was during the fire, we don't know, but that cannon barrel survived the fire, and one of a few that were over there was brought in and mounted right here. So, knowing that, we know the situation of this building on the hill. A fire insurance map that we have also shows that there are a series of structures that sort of spread out from behind there, one of them the kitchen, and we believe, and local folks tell us, that the foundation of that pool house that's screened in back there, and it's just the foundation, was probably that kitchen that was associated with the infirmary. The 1920 this wing that was over here was damaged and it was rebuilt, but eventually this went back in service. This complex of building and some of the other outbuildings, you know, represented what was the Confederate home. They just didn't try to rebuild that part of it. And by that time, there were fewer and fewer veterans all the time that needed housing. Let's come over here and take a look. Are any questions, by the way?
Was there anyone injured in the fire?
26 men were hospitalized, but no one was killed. Well, that $57,000 improvement to the site included a lot of money for that infirmary. But there were other buildings that came from other sources. We'll talk about the LZ Duke Hall down here in a minute. But this gives you another little bit better perspective on the infirmary complex. As you look at this right here, this is what one of the wings looked like, the near wing of the infirmary looked like. This is the building that we looked at in the previous image. So if you're the photographer, you would have been looking about that direction, and that's the view that you would have seen. This other image, which we just fairly recently got a hold of to do some research, shows post-fire, post-1920 fire, what was left. And that's this complex of buildings, the infirmary complex with a center and then two wings. You can see two water towers back there. During the fire, one of the water towers exploded. We'll talk a little bit more about water. It was a constant challenge for them. It was one of the disadvantages of this site. They didn't have enough water. But we've been able to figure out where these buildings were in large part because we've been able to find some landmarks to identify. This road that sweeps up here, this is actually a road that leads from Central Avenue farther down that way and comes up this hill and meets the property. We were able to even find a number of these metal posts deep in the thicket of the woods there that kind of help identify where this building was situated. We talked about who was buried out there. There's even one of the nurses from the home here that is buried out at the Confederate cemetery. This is an image of the LZ Duke Hall, and this was built in 1907. It was a gift of Mrs. LZ Duke, who had an affection for the inmates here, as they were called. They were referred to as inmates, and this became sort of a social hall. Entertainments were put on there. We don't know exactly where it was, but we believe it to be right up in this area. And there's a little evidence of another building back here. There's a dwelling. We have a map that shows several dwellings kind of back here on the back side of this hill. And there were a lot of people living here. It wasn't just the inmates. Some of the help lived here, and there was seasonal help, and there were tradesmen. So it was almost a village within a village in many ways. And to tell you a little bit more about what life was like for the inmates, we're fortunate to have Bob Fortunato with us here, who's going to give you a little bit of the perspective of the inmate veteran here at the home. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much. Well, when you got accepted here, you needed an honorable discharge. And once you got accepted, you reported. They would issue you a military type uniform, gray uniforms. You had to accept a military lifestyle with strict rules. Misbehavior wasn't tolerated. The long gray coats were worn at the main meal. But it was a wonderful place. Most of the veterans came from poverty. You can imagine those many years after the war. And so it was a wonderful life. Every morning, 6 a.m., reveille. Many years, started off with a cannon fire. You would report, fall in for roll call. The honor guard would raise the flag. There was a U.S. flag and a Confederate flag that flew over the home. Then we would march off to breakfast, and just wonderful breakfast, biscuits and gravy and ham and eggs and potatoes, lots of fruit preserves. Just were treated wonderfully. After breakfast, those that were able would stroll around the grounds. You were not permitted to leave the grounds without a furlough, a written furlough, like a pass. So you could pursue your hobbies, gardening. Those that were able to do so would help with some of the repair work. The main meal was at noon, big full meal. After that, quite a few of the men took naps, or you could play checkers, pursue your hobbies, do the gardening again. Many special afternoons were provided by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Would see that we had recitals or poets, other kinds of entertainment. There were some traveling vaudeville shows, vaudeville actors, religious activities, Wednesdays and Sundays. Traveling evangelical preachers would come in, or if someone chose to go to another church, they could get a furlough on a Sunday morning to attend one of the local churches. The rooms were very clean, 2 to 4 men to a room. We were issued a tobacco allowance, a couple of plugs of tobacco or some pipe tobacco. No smoking in the rooms, though. No whiskey on the premises. However, the doctor could dispense whiskey when necessary. No drunkenness was permitted. That was cause for expulsion. A third drunkenness offense, and you were no longer allowed to stay here. We had movies on occasion. Those that passed away received a full military type funeral, dressed in their Confederate uniforms. Does anybody have any questions? Anything specific? Oh, the bathing area. We had bathtubs where you could take a weekly bath. Those that were unable to bathe themselves, there were male nurses available. There is that one male nurse buried here in the cemetery. I'd say the rooms were sprayed once a week. I've told you that, okay. The only thing that bothered me here were the stories that the men told about the wars. It was such a horrible war. If you got shot, those lead bullets tore through human bodies the way they shouldn't. One of the friends that I met here was a fellow named Taylor McCoy. Taylor McCoy grew up here in Kentucky and grew up in the woods, lived in the woods most of his life. He could tell what time it was at night by the stars. Excellent tracker. Lived with nature. He was a sharpshooter. He could shoot the eye out of a squirrel 100 yards away. So he was part of the sharpshooters unit. And the first battle he was in, they came under fire, and that's from snipers, and they would call up the sharpshooters. So they called up Taylor, and he got in position and finally was able to read some movement up in a tree. He fired a shot, and there was a scream. A young boy fell out of the tree. Taylor fell to the ground. His major ran over and said, "Taylor, are you shot?" And he said, "No, I have just killed a boy. I came here not to kill boys, but men." Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Okay.
Appreciate your time. All right, folks, we're going to continue our tour by heading back over the other side of the property and looking at some remnants of the laundry and an area that's one of the few areas that still has part of a structure remaining on the back of the property. This is kind of the last area we're going to look at today. What I want to point out is the center portion of this house, the brick section in the middle there. The tradition is that that was the laundry for the original Villa Ridge Inn. And we see fire maps that show it's like a big building. And you've seen farmhouses and barns that over the years have become connected by a series of buildings between the two. I think that's kind of what happened right here. We had a big building there. We had a kitchen, or rather a laundry, and often buildings that had some fire function, a kitchen, a laundry, a boiler room. They were masonry. You set them apart from that. So there's sort of this thin stretch of buildings that went back here and met this structure. We're going to get a better look at that on the back. Now the sections to the right and the left of center were built later on, and you'll be able to sort of understand that a little bit better as we get in the back of the property. One of the big challenges of life here, or really the operation of the Confederate home, was the lack of water. They sank well after well. They had cisterns. They tried to hang on to water. They're on a hill. There's a lot of water and springs in different places, but nothing up here. So they're constantly sinking wells, and there's evidence of a well or cistern over here. There was another one over this direction, and we'll see what was once the reservoir, or the area where they had a reservoir, down on the back side of the hill here. So if you'll just follow me down the way here. Okay, you know something that I neglected to mention earlier that I'd like to do, and that's thank the Presbyterian Church for allowing us on this part of the property. This is part of their property, and this is a rental home that they own, and they've been generous enough, both the folks that are tenants there and the church, to allow us to tromp around on their property. And the same way with McMahon's on top of the hill where we were visiting the infirmary. So, from this angle, you can see a little bit better what I was talking about with the laundry foundation. If you look at the center section of the house, you see a tall stone foundation. We believe that that center section amounted to the laundry, and other records indicate that's a boiler room. So it could have very easily switched between those two functions, or it was misidentified on a map. Kind of hard to say what was going on there. The only other thing that we can think of that may have changed was I suspect the building might have been taller because it seems more prominent, vertically prominent, in some of the photographs that we look at. But that stucco chimney, we think, is also, part or portion of the original chimney up through that space. I mentioned water being a problem up there a little bit earlier. I think this will help orient you here a little bit. I want to pass this around. Take a look at this image. The house in the background is this house that you're looking at right here. This is a fire insurance map, undated. We're not quite sure when this was drawn, and we're not sure that it actually represents exactly how the complex was laid out, but we believe it to be fairly accurate. There's a large pool that was actually a reservoir of water that they needed. When they had this many inmates here, they needed a lot of water, and some reports were up to 8,000 gallons a day. So the legislature authorized the construction of this major reservoir. This fence line right here drops off right on the other side, and there's a brick or a masonry retaining wall. As you kind of pass that around, you can see it, and it held 12 million gallons of water. It didn't function that well for that long. It was stale and stagnant, hard to make it potable, but there was a huge investment of dollars in getting water here. In fact, the water that came here was pumped from 2.5 miles away at what is known as O'Bannon, which, if you're familiar with the area, the intersection of 146 that runs through town here and the Gene Snyder, right in that area. So it's 2.5 miles directly that way that they paid for all the infrastructure to get this water in here to fill up this reservoir, because it was a constant struggle for them to get enough water to use. And I'd like to welcome, Patty Beth Miller, Parish Miller. I forgot a parish in there. We've had the perspective of an Orphan Brigade member. We've had the perspective of a Confederate Veterans Home inmate. And now we're going to give you the perspective of someone who lived on this property as a child. Thank you. Here you go.
Okay. Hi. My family moved out here in about 1962. I was 3. I have 3 sisters and my mom and dad. The house had been empty for about 15 years when we moved out. A Dr. Bolton had bought it, a dentist, local dentist, and he had built the addition to the house to the part of the old, what we thought was the old laundry. It was very unique. The new addition had 2-story rooms. It had 12-foot windows. It was just a beautiful addition and a beautiful home. We had a 7.5 acres here. We had an apple and fruit orchard where the parking lot is now, probably where you parked at the Presbyterian Church. That was our fruit orchard. And again, Dr. Bolton had planted all that. The rose garden, you can still see the footprint over here next to the pool. It's a perfect square and it's a very flat area. There were 100 to 200 roses there when we moved out here. And my mother loved gardens and loved roses, so we cleaned it out and she tended those roses until she died in 1977. And I'm not sure when they were taken out, but you can still see the brick outline of the beds in the ground if you walk over and look. And we think the brick outline is from brick that was piled up on the property after the fire. It was just leftover brick, and we even had piles that we would find of stone and brick that were left over that we were told to stay away from because of snakes. But we knew where they all were. Living in the house was a wonderful place to grow up. It was very cold in the house. Our heat wasn't very good. The windows leaked pretty bad. It was your typical old building. And the pipes froze every year. They were outside of the house rather than inside or under the house. So one of the reasons Dad moved to Florida to get away from the winters here. There are a few ghost stories my sister and I have. You know, if you're interested, we can tell you about the ghost stories. We felt like they were always friendly spirits, though. We never had any negative experiences here at all. And it was just a wonderful place to grow up. Lots of perennial gardens were here when we moved. We think we're from the time period of the Confederate home, where people had obviously gardened. Again, brick-edged peonies and coneflower and plants that would have survived many, many years of neglect of being left. And we also have some very unique trees and plantings here. We think Dr. Bolton put in when he moved. He was quite a plantsman. He had put in the rose garden. There's a banana magnolia tree behind you. It has huge long leaves, and that is not native or commonly found in this area. And there's bamboo, stands of bamboo here, and many, many different types of plants that I know because now I'm a horticulturist. I think because I grew up on this property. This is a tulip magnolia, and they actually were part of a path from the back door that came right between these two and went down to the reservoir. And in the spring, daffodils will pop up on both sides and line the whole path all the way down. It's beautiful. I'm not sure what it went to. There was some kind of a concrete pad here, probably some kind of a pump. There was a pump right on the other side of the tree line that would pump water from here up to what was an underground greenhouse. And if you walk up, you'll see the stone and see the underground greenhouse. It was here. There's a little fish pond there. My dad would try to fill with water and put fish in. Never successful keeping them alive, though. And when we did move out, the winter we came, he found a 33-inch catfish frozen in the ice. So he was very excited, thinking this was going to be a great fishing pond, but that was the only big catfish we ever found. It was the last one. The water did get pretty nasty in the summer. Duckweed would grow over it. It was not spring-fed enough to really keep the water high enough and clean. So it got a little nasty in the summer. In the winter, it would freeze over and we would ice skate. Had a great time on it. One year in the mid-70s, I think it was, he finally decided he wanted to find out what was under all that water. And he got a boat at an antiques, it was a flea market or something. He got a boat real cheap. And he and his buddy went out and decided to put a bamboo pole down and see if they could find out how deep it was and what was on the bottom. But when they got out halfway into the water, they sprung a leak and had to get back to shore real fast. He did have it drained in the late 70s and had it dug out to find the bottom. It had a stone bottom and it was about 12 feet deep, we found. And we did not sift through the soil that they pulled out to find artifacts. The only thing we found was a chair that had sunk when we were ice skating one time. And we did find some spoons, and we found a pair of spectacles. The cistern in the front yard, we actually lowered my sister in one time to see what was inside. It was brick lined. It was in very good shape when we lived here, and it has the manhole cover on it. We lowered her down and had her sift through and find what she could find, and she found a pair of spectacles still in their case, and that was our treasure for the day. We found shards of pottery in there, dishes, broken pieces that we think after the fire they just threw everything in there, garbage they were trying to get rid of. So lots of fun history here. We had a great time. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Hey, thank you very much. Well, in March 1920, probably the biggest change and, you know, maybe a bit of a bellwether of the decline of the Confederate home took place. A fire broke out in the rear portion of the original Villa Ridge Inn, which would have been just in front of this house, as we discussed before. And the place was entirely consumed. The inmates, newspaper accounts say a rebel yell went out and everyone escaped to safety. But the fire was enormous. They called in departments from Crestwood and Louisville. It burned through the night. It lit up the night sky, and strong, apparently, south wind, maybe like stronger than what we're feeling today, took sparks nearly a quarter-mile away and burned down a house that was called Undulata, a very early home over there at the end of Muir Lane, burned that night. There were 26 inmates who were in the infirmary. They were transferred to a hospital. They were secreted out, or publicly secreted out, to the hospital, and the other inmates who were here were taken into homes around Pewee. The big inn was gone. Part of the infirmary was destroyed, but within a few years that was rebuilt. The infirmary portion was, and that became the sum total of the home. So by 1934, it was time to close this property down. There were fewer and fewer veterans all the time. I mean, time marches on, and in 1934, I believe there were just 5 left, and they were transferred to another home here in the area, a rest home. And that was the end of the story for the Confederate home here in Pewee Valley. You know, the people of Pewee Valley, for as hard as they fought the construction or the placement of the Confederate home here in 1902, really came to embrace the veterans, and the veterans embraced them, and it became a point of pride for the community through those years. So we're very fortunate to kind of take this walk down memory lane and look at this again. So thank you very much for your time. As we walk back through the property here, I'm glad to answer any questions you might have, or talk a little bit more with you about what you've seen and heard here today. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.